Right. Well, it's 7 minutes past the hour. Shall we get started? Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar. First of all, Happy New Year, ladies and gentlemen. We hope that you are safe, healthy, and sound, and our best wishes for this new year, with new opportunities and new challenges. Happy to be part of this webinar. I'm going to be your moderator today. My name is Juan Pablo O'Farrell. I work for the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, in Mexico as a National Disaster Response Advisor, but I was well part of the network of a pool of people that are deployed to respond to environmental emergencies, and part of the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this webinar and to walk you through its content. As you know, this webinar aims to talk about the response on the environmental dimensions of emergencies, with the support of the UN Environmental Programme and, of course, OCHA, in this very important topic, with great actuality, because, as you know, disasters in Latin America and the Caribbean has dramatically increased, not only because of climate change impact, but as well because of the increase of other global and regional challenges, of course, as the increase of poverty and therefore vulnerability on people, rapid urbanization, and of course the COVID pandemic, which brings another layer of complexity for the response that of course causes a greater humanitarian impact on people, more chronic humanitarian needs, and of course complexity in operation. So that's why this webinar is key, because the environmental dimensions of emergencies is central for the response, and of course for preparedness. So welcome to this space in which we are going to discuss, of course, some very interesting case studies, give you very important background information on how this works, why we have this service as international community, and how a very specific unit created already 26 years now ago by a partnership of UN Environmental Programme, UNEP, and OCHA, to support countries to strengthen their capacities to respond to these environmental dimensions of disasters, and of course as well of complex emergencies. This unit is a specific unit, was created, as I mentioned, 25 years ago, and has more than 2021 field experiences already since 1994, and the GEU, as the acronym, Joint Environmental Unit, that has its headquarters in Geneva, but as well we have a coordination structure regional based in Panama. Well, how this unit promotes and strengthens the national capacities to cover this important aspect of the response. So LAC region, as I mentioned, is one of the most exposed regions to disasters, not only natural but man-made as well. High rates of impact, but as well a region that has a very sound and developing industrial structure, lots of hazards concerning chemical hazards and other aspects that could, of course, be the root of problems, and of course emergencies that could be on the top of that. Today, we're going to have a very interesting panel with high top-level specialists that I'm going to present, not without mentioning that this initiative has been strengthened recently by the creation of a forum of ministers since last year, that strengthened, of course, the capacities of the region, but as well a regional network on environmental and emergencies. So without further ado, I am going to present our panelists today, our top panelists today. You have seen, of course, the flyer, but let me just present first of all Mr. Dan Stotthard, which is a regional coordinator for disaster and conflicts of UNEP Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. Hello, Dan. Thank you for being here with us. Dan is a humanitarian regional officer for Latin America and the Caribbean, and he coordinates the disasters and conflicts within a sub-program that focus on response to emergencies and mainstream environment into humanitarian action, addressing the relationship between environment and security. He holds a master's degree in disaster management from the UK. Hello, Dan. Please allow me to present now Ms. Margherita Franciotti, Dr. Margherita Franciotti, who's the focal point for response at UNEP OCHA Joint Environmental Unit, which I mentioned is based in Geneva. She coordinates the mobilization of international environmental assistance in response to emergencies and leads the UNEP OCHA joint training portfolio. Hello, Doctor. She holds a master's degree on geography and environmental science from the UK as well. And last but not least, Roxana Popescu. She's an environmental expert with a background in geography and environmental management. Of course, she's a candidate as well for a PhD program in Belgium and Tahiti, focusing on post-Irma disaster waste management in St. Martin. But besides her academical background, she's as well a field officer with lots of experience working on this issue, and served as a consultant for various government on the multilateral agencies, not only Latin America, but in the Caribbean as well, for emergency preparedness and response. She was deployed within the UNEP and OCHA joint environmental framework to Dominica and IMA in the Caribbean. So she's going to share with us some of her field experiences and lessons learned. So to start, I will explain that this webinar is composed in two different stages. The first, Dan Stotthard and Margherita Franciotti, they are going to talk us and share with us key information on why this joint environmental unit exists, which are the services, which are the tools, how does it work, how to request assistance, the different modalities, and then we are going to have a second half, a final half, in which we are going to talk about very practical experiences, field experiences that concern the responses implemented of this unit in after the impact of Hurricanes Maria and Irma in 2017 and Hurricane Dorian in 2019. All this is going to be shared thanks to Margarita's and Roxana's experiences in the field. So without further ado, let's get started. Not without remembering you and inviting you to please register into the webinar so we can have your contact details, please. This is on the chat. You will find a web page where you could do so. This is important because with that we are going to know who attended the webinar and continue sharing information. But as well, there's another aspect of the chat, which is, of course, the last part of our webinar, which is a question and answer session that we are going to close with this webinar. And please write down your questions within the chat, and we are going to ensure to answer to them at the end of the webinar. I will give the floor to our panelists, not without thanking Diego Reyes as well, who's here with us, assisting on managing the virtual platform. Thank you, Diego. And as I mentioned, without further ado, I will open the floor and give the word to Mr. Dan Stotter to talk us on environment and emergencies and why, how does this work. Thank you, Dan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, and good morning, everyone. It might be surprising that it's actually still necessary to have a presentation on why environment and emergencies, but there are a lot of different perceptions about what the environmental dimension of emergencies means, a lot of assumptions that different actors have, and still sometimes some questions around whether or not environment is really a relevant question in first phase response, whether it's something that humanitarian actors should be considering. So hopefully I will be able to address some of these as the intro to this webinar. Next slide, please. So maybe setting the groundwork by looking at some of the assumptions that humanitarian actors have about what environment in emergencies actually means. I say this because I come from the humanitarian world myself, and so I'm aware of the way sometimes environment is perceived in very different ways. There's often an assumption that integrating environment means extra activities such as reforestation, that it means doing more than we would already do, and that by extension it's therefore complicated and expensive and requires additional resources. There's sometimes a perception that environment is optional, or that it should be optional. That it's an add-on, that it's something that we can address once the response is at full capacity and all of the other humanitarian activities are covered. There's often an assumption that integrating environment means talking about climate change adaptation, and that therefore, if the emergency that we're dealing with is not a climatic emergency, for example, an earthquake, that environment might not be a relevant question. And often a perception that environment is limited to mitigating the environmental footprint of the response, a kind of corrective or green police approach, rather than necessarily environment being something that can actually be integrated and have a positive value towards the resolution of humanitarian needs, which is what humanitarians are there for. So I think it's important to highlight that environment can be mainstreamed. It's not necessarily about additional activities, and in fact, the two case studies that we have later will show quite clearly how environment relates to other sectors, particularly water and sanitation and public health. Integrating environment can be quite simple. It can be something that you do when you do your public health messaging, simply adding additional messages on, and therefore not require much in the way of additional resources or cost. It doesn't automatically mean doing climate change adaptation in emergencies. Although that said, there are initiatives looking at adaptation in humanitarian hotspots, particularly in Africa, because it's always been assumed in the past that adaptation activities cannot be implemented during a humanitarian crisis, and we're realizing now that this is not necessarily the case. And in terms of whether environment is an optional add-on that should be addressed once the response is at full capacity, I have to admit I would throw that challenge back to all of my fellow humanitarians and ask them if they've ever seen a fully funded humanitarian response, because in my years in the sector, I certainly haven't. So as a result, when we're integrating environment into humanitarian response, what we're really talking about is fulfilling humanitarian principles, especially the principle of doing no harm. That we as humanitarians will not do harm by our actions, but we'll also not do harm by omission. We're trying to facilitate intersectoral analysis of needs, so looking at how environmental issues bridge different sectors such as water, such as health, such as livelihoods, and looking at how we can conduct strategic planning for the different sectors as a part of the humanitarian response. Next slide, please. So environmentalists also have their own assumptions about what the integration of environment into a humanitarian response means. There are some environmentalists who believe that environment has to wait until the emergency is over, that there is no space for them, or that simply the speed of the emergency response does not give them the opportunity to do things the way that they would. Humanitarian response does tend to be very fast in the first phases, and environmental activities have tended to take a longer time frame. There are many environmentalists who believe that they end up cleaning up after the responders, which creates a certain tension in the relationship between environmental actors and humanitarian responders. Some environmentalists understand humanitarian response meaning purely search and rescue and management of shelters, and therefore see very little space for environment in those activities, particularly in search and rescue. And some also feel that environment means focusing only on long-term goals, and that the short time horizons of an emergency response therefore don't provide a space for environmentalists to add value. This leads to a perception that therefore environmentalists and humanitarian responders have nothing in common. I think it's important to recognize that while the timeframes of an emergency remain the same, whether or not environment is integrated into an emergency, it is possible to achieve short-term goals, short-term environmental goals within the timeframes of an emergency, and that you can also lay the groundwork during the first phase of an emergency for delivery on activities that resolve both environmental problems, but also contribute to the resolution of humanitarian needs and the needs for long-term recovery and resilience building. Working together, therefore, humanitarian responders and environmental actors can reduce environmental legacies, being things that will obviously impact on humanitarian needs over the long term. Therefore, they do have things in common. They can avoid damage caused by the response, coming back to the idea of a corrective approach, and also avoid damage caused by the coping strategies that the population sometimes has to adopt in order to survive, facilitate early recovery, and then a faster return to working on sustainable development. Many environmental objectives can still be achieved within the short time horizons of an emergency response. Next slide, please. On the screen, you have the official definition of an environmental emergency. You will have heard that I've been talking about the environmental dimensions of an emergency, and a few slides later, I'll come on to why. But since 2002, a definition of environmental emergency does exist, which is on the screen. However, you can see that this definition relates primarily to rapid onset emergencies only. There is very little in here related to humanitarian emergencies caused by social phenomena, whether it be, for example, economic crisis or social conflict, and that as a definition, it's somewhat limited. Next slide, please. We tend to refer to the environmental dimensions of crisis now, precisely because there are very few emergencies out there which do not have an environmental angle, even if their initial cause is not necessarily a natural hazard. Next slide, please. So looking at what the environmental dimensions of emergencies and crises might actually mean, there is no officially defined framework. So what I'm putting on the screen are more ways to think about it. This is not an official framework that you'll be able to find in published papers. But if we start looking at environmental causal factors, we could be looking at environmental events which directly cause a crisis, or a conflict which is driven by environmental factors. So here we might be talking about chemical spills, for example, the oil spill that you can see on the photo behind me, industrial accidents, zoonotic disease, which is disease spread from animals to humans, like, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, or conflicts over control of natural resources. We're talking about environment as a trigger event. It could also be a resource dispute or contested legal ruling over natural resources which triggers a conflict. Next slide, please. So then, if we already have an emergency caused by whatever factor it may be, environmental or not, there's also the possibility that environmental factors worsen existing humanitarian needs and vulnerability. For example, if we take the COVID-19 pandemic, areas of high air pollution generally have a greater people living in areas of high air pollution have a greater likelihood of developing the worst forms of COVID-19 because they already have existing morbidity as a result of an environmental problem. So here you can see that no matter what the humanitarian emergency may be, environmental determinants of health can therefore affect the severity of humanitarian needs in that area. Next, please. There's also environmental factors which can then affect long-term survival, coping, or resilience of the population in the context of chronic crisis or in the context of trying to recover from a crisis. These would be the effects of the environment undermining the ecosystem services that people depend on, for example, or the generation of long-term environmental legacies. Crisis waste after a hurricane or an earthquake can remain around for a long time after the emergency, sometimes for tens of years or generations, contaminating the soil, contaminating sources of water, and therefore undermining public health or the viability of agriculture and livelihoods in the area. And these are therefore environmental dimensions affecting recovery, resilience, and long-term development. Next, please. And then lastly, there's also environmental factors related to the response. For example, there can be the negative environmental impacts of response activities or the negative impacts of the coping strategies that the population adopt. Here we might be talking about environmental damage from waste production, from waste as a result of distributions, packaging, excess extraction of water resulting in the drying of aquifers, etc. But there's also positive environmental impacts that the response can have. The response can be used to improve environmental management, for example, by promoting green jobs. In Brazil, in northern Brazil, an area which is receiving a lot of Venezuelan refugees and migrants at the moment, there is a government program to try and redistribute Venezuelan refugees and migrants around the country and to reduce the pressure on the one northern state of Brazil that has a border with Venezuela. And UNHCR is actually working to map the job market in Brazil to identify where are the opportunities in the job market for green jobs being jobs that contribute to the management of environment, for example, national park management, waste management, and similar. And what they're trying to do is to see how Venezuelan refugees and migrants can be inserted into the green economy to both give them a durable solution to living in Brazil and a dignified life, while also contributing to the environmental management of the country. So coming back to the point I was making earlier about integrating climate change adaptation into response, this could be an opportunity to do that and for the response to have a positive environmental impact. So it's important to remember that integrating environment can be positive and it's not always negative or corrective or the environmental police coming. And we can mitigate the climate impact of our operations, the negative impacts of response activities, for example, through green office, sustainable procurement, and monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions of emergency responses. Next slide, please. To give a quick example of this relationship, I've tried to do it with the humanitarian emergency that most of the world is living right now, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we start off on the top left, looking at how the virus creates humanitarian needs, and then as a result, we end up with a humanitarian response. The environmental impact of that response might include, for example, healthcare waste, the waste resulting from NFI distributions and packaging, pollution resulting from chemical products, disinfectants, etc., construction waste as a result of building new shelters or isolation units, and the environmental impact of different coping strategies. But then there's also those external environmental factors which can worsen existing needs and vulnerabilities. For example, air pollution, overcrowding, dangerous livelihoods such as informal mining, unsafe water, or the inappropriate management of waste. And that then goes back to contributing to those humanitarian needs which are already being created by the pandemic in this case. Next slide, please. So integrating environment into the response is really about getting the right people into your response and the right resources in the right place. We're never going to be able to do it everywhere. There simply aren't enough people, there aren't enough opportunities, there aren't enough resources. However, selecting carefully where we do it is how we can maximize the best, how we can best maximize the impact of integrating environment into the response, and therefore improving the quality of that response in humanitarian terms. For example, what's the priority location? You wouldn't be integrating environment into a response if there were no connection between the environmental problems that you're looking at and the humanitarian impact. So trying to look at the priority location based on an alignment of humanitarian need and humanitarian impact, but remembering that those environmental problems might actually be caused upstream of where your humanitarian needs are most being experienced. Thinking about those humanitarian needs and impacts and the coping strategies that might affect the environment, think about what are the most immediate humanitarian needs. For example, water, shelter, food, protection, livelihoods, and how those needs relate to the environment in the local context. People may have been forced to adopt short-term coping strategies that may be environmentally damaging, and as humanitarian responders, advice may be needed to help people adopt new coping strategies which have less environmental impact. We need to identify the right environmental expertise to address those problems and ensure it can be made understandable and relevant to the response, creating a symbiotic relationship. So we need solid experts with good communication skills, because if nobody can understand their recommendations, the recommendations won't be prioritized for implementation. But it's important to remember that generalists can do most of this work. And in fact, Margarita will come on to the profile of the sort of people who are most commonly integrated into emergency responses by the Joint Environment Unit. Thinking about the actions that need to be prioritized, we need to prioritize the environmental actions with the most immediate bearing on lives, livelihoods, and the humanitarian situation. Coming back to the question of timeframes. So, for example, we wouldn't necessarily be prioritizing the development of a big environmental strategy with a 20-year timeframe. We'd be looking at what we can do that will have a short-term impact, both on needs and on the environment. And so therefore we need to start off fast and cover the essentials. This isn't the time for peer-reviewed high science. This is the time for going back to basics and doing what will have the fastest impact on humanitarian needs by improving the environmental situation. Next slide, please. These are some brief examples of some of the emergency responses that the Joint Environment Unit and the Latin America Office have responded to over the last few years. I'm not going to read through all of them. But most of them can be downloaded as technical reports from the EE Center website that Margarita will present in her next slide, in her next presentation, pardon me. Next slide, please. So showing that actually there isn't so much difference between what environmentalists and humanitarians are looking for, think about how environmental degradation or pollution can directly contribute to or even cause a crisis to which then humanitarians will respond. We need to understand that environmental factors can worsen those existing humanitarian needs. So here we're talking about the physical and mental well-being of the population and also their quality of life. And those are humanitarian indicators. Environment can affect long-term survival, coping, and resilience, which again is of interest to humanitarian responders. And the response that can damage the environment or contribute to resource-based conflicts if it's not designed carefully, which would therefore undermine humanitarian compliance with the do no harm principle. And as I said, the response can be used to improve environmental management, for example, opening up new opportunities, green jobs, new practices in terms of waste management, etc. This isn't rocket science. In the end, for many years, we've been talking about how a crisis can be an opportunity and how actually emergencies are one of the best opportunities to promote gender equality, because quite often, because of the temporary societal changes, women adopt new roles. For example, during the Second World War in Europe, many women assumed jobs that were typically presumed to be jobs of men because the men were deployed to fight. And after the war, women were able to use that experience to continue the struggle for gender equality. In the end, a humanitarian crisis can be an opportunity to promote a new way of working in relationship to the environment. all of these issues can relate back to humanitarian protection. So it's important to mention that we're not just talking about technical niches here, but thinking, for example, around the role of illicit environmental economies in humanitarian needs, or the role of child labor in relation to the environment. For example, children who, as a coping strategy, go and work as scavengers on a dump, which I've seen in many emergencies in this region. Integrating environment also means addressing humanitarian needs such as protection, or the exposure to violence as a result of the need to go and satisfy fuel or water needs. So by providing a sustainable fuel and providing water, we're reducing a protection risk, but we're also having a beneficial effect on the environment. Next slide, please. From here, I think the best way to pick up some of the points that I've left behind is to transfer over to Margarita's presentation, looking at some of the ways by which the Joint Environment Unit can deploy expertise into an emergency response to try and address these relationships that I've presented. Over to you, Juan Pablo and Margarita.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for this comprehensive presentation that clearly illustrates the importance of ensuring the environmental dimension in humanitarian response, but as well give very important insights on the interaction and the complexity in relation with other challenges, operational, of course, but as well with development, recovery, risk management, and of course, the implications within the COVID-19 response today. Well, now we are going to complement this information with Margarita's intervention that is going to walk us through the aspect of the joint unit and the UNEP response, specifically on the mechanism that is offered to support governments and humanitarian community, of course, and the people that we serve. Margarita, thank you for your presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo, and a very good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to I'm joining you from outside the region, from Geneva, from the Joint Environment Unit. And in my presentation, yes, I will indeed talk a little bit more about the process to mobilize international assistance to respond to the environmental dimensions of emergencies, which services specifically UNEP can offer, and how they can be requested. Next slide, please. So the Joint Environment Unit, as we've heard, is really a partnership between the two organizations, between OCHA and UNEP, and it brings together OCHA's humanitarian mandate with UNEP environmental expertise. If we can move to the next slide, please. We can see that the Joint Environment Unit was established in 1994, as we've also heard from Juan Pablo, at the request of UN member states. And the mission of the unit is to save lives, livelihoods, and the environment on which people depend. And we support countries and affected populations in achieving this goal as well. Next, please. The Joint Environment Unit acts as the primary point of contact whenever there is an emergency, and support is requested to specifically address the environmental dimensions of that emergency. We can be reached 24/7, so we are always available, and we can advise on immediate actions to take, but we can also mobilize international assistance, whether through deployments, so dispatch of experts and equipment to the field, to the ground, or also by providing remote support. Next slide, please. We've had many missions since the establishment of the unit, and you see here on this slide just the latest deployment in 2020, so during the COVID-19 pandemic. The latest missions were the experts to Honduras after hurricanes Eta and Iota. That was really the last emergencies that we have supported, but also earlier in the year, in 2020, we dispatched a team to Lebanon after the port explosions in August, and also to Mauritius after an oil spill. Both these emergencies happened in August last year. We look at the trends of requests for international assistance. We see that there is an increasing trend since the establishment of the unit in 1994. So today we receive more requests for international assistance than we did in the past. Next slide, please. And the geographic distribution of those requests and then therefore the response that we provide is quite homogeneous. We see that if we look specifically at the Americas, it's about it's 20% more or less of the total response missions that we've had so far. Next slide, please. Now, when is international assistance typically requested? It can be requested for a number of different reasons. Typically, it's usually either because national capacity is overwhelmed, and so there is a need for international capacity to support, or it could be because there's a need for overall coordination, or there could be a need for highly specialized expertise, technical expertise that is not otherwise available in country. Or it can be also if the country is in conflict or if there are transboundary impacts, as we've seen in the case of Colombia, and there is a need overall for neutral and independent assessments on which the UN can support. Next. These are just, of course, some examples of when international assistance is requested, but are the most common circumstances under which that usually happens. Now, which type of technical expertise can be requested and can be mobilized by the Joint Environment Unit? You see here a matrix of all the profiles that we can dispatch. Notably, we can supply either more generalist kind of expertise, so to support in general on rapid environmental assessments more broadly, so looking at different types of issues, or we can also mobilize specialized expertise in areas like contamination, for example, after oil spills, as we've heard also from some of the examples from Dan, chemical contamination. It could be specifically on water management, or on waste management. We'll hear the example also of Dominica on that. It can be for a number of other, types of specialized expertise. I want to mention also that in the case, for example, of wildfires, we usually support also in assessing the environmental impacts of those of fires. Next slide, please. Now let's have a look at the types of expertise among those that I just mentioned that are most requested in practice. So we see that overall, the large majority of experts that we dispatch are generalists. So they typically support with rapid environmental assessments after the emergency, but we also deploy a number of specialists, and you see here, you get here an idea of the profiles that are most requested. Next slide, please. Now, in which form can we mobilize and can we offer this kind of expertise? Well, it can be through deployment of experts and also equipment that goes along also to the experts perform their tasks at short notice. We usually speak of 48 hours from a request for international assistance. And of course, we deal with emergencies, so time is of the essence. We only work in the immediate emergency response phase. This is, of course, we are a partnership between UNEP and OCHA, so that means that we operate within the time frame that is that of OCHA. So in the immediate emergency response phase, and nonetheless, other colleagues in UNEP can also support, other teams and other divisions of UNEP can also support on longer term recovery and disaster risk reduction. But that's not the core focus of the unit. We only work on the immediate emergency response phase. Now, the typical duration of an emergency response mission is between 2 and 4 weeks. And support can be either dispatched on standalone environmental response missions that are typically entirely coordinated by the JU, the Joint Environment Unit, or it can be also environmental experts that are deployed as part of UNDAC teams, so teams of the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Mechanism that can offer support on broader emergency response. So looking also at humanitarian coordination and humanitarian assessments among the different types of expertise that are usually requested in dealing with all of the impacts related to the emergency. But we can integrate environmental expertise, embed environmental expertise in those teams, so that environmental issues are also addressed at the early stages of the response. Next slide, please. Now, by whom can this be requested? Who can request this type of support, and what's the way to actually request it? It can be requested either by governments or by UN resident coordinators. And it's usually requested through a formal request for assistance that can be addressed to us either via the UN resident coordinators offices or UNEP and OCHA field offices. So country offices, if there is a country office in the country that has been affected by an emergency, via our regional offices, or AJU, and you see here the email address to do that. In any case, of course, any support that we dispatch is always dispatched in coordination with all of the actors that I've just mentioned. We have a document in the Environmental Emergencies Guidelines that you see referenced here, and we will share the links to that. That contains also all the details, all the procedure in more detail to request assistance, and also includes a checklist for assistance with the information that we would typically need to be able to dispatch the support that is will really match what is needed in country. So we'll share the link to that. Next slide, please. But overall, this is the process to request assistance. Next, yeah. Perfect. So this is the process to request assistance, and I would like to conclude just by mentioning that in addition to working only on response, we also work on preparedness for response specifically. So trying to have all processes in place before an emergency happens, and helping countries on that as well. And I will just like to highlight just a few initiatives in that sense. Next slide, please. One of them is our learning portal. The Environmental Emergency Center is our website of reference for everything that relates to the work that we do on emergency response and readiness for response. So we'll refer you to that as well. We'll post the link. And on that website, we have all the mission reports, as Dan was mentioning before. And we also have a learning portal with 5 online courses that are accessible for everyone to take. Next slide, please. In addition to these 5 e-learning modules, this year we've also, last year in 2020, we have also run a global webinar series on environmental emergencies in the face of COVID. It was a new initiative that, of course, we developed to primarily overcome all the access and movement constraints that we had during COVID, but to still engage with our networks and with governments and countries worldwide. And it was a very successful experience. We had 6 webinars. You see all the data here. We had an outstanding level of participation with close to 6,000 certificates of participation issued. Next slide, please. And I would just like to conclude by mentioning that we also run face-to-face trainings. That, of course, has been placed on hold during COVID, but we are planning to have 2 courses in 2021 with dates to be defined depending on how the COVID situation evolves. And one will be global, at the global level in English in Slovenia, so open to all countries worldwide. And then there will be one specifically for the region in Spanish, and that will be in Mexico with Juan Pablo, of course, as well, and with most of the colleagues that are joining me today. That's all from my side. On the next slide, you have my contact details. So please feel free also to reach out afterwards if you post also the questions in the Q&A, and I will get back to you later to present, to talk about the Bahamas. Thank you. Over to you, Juan Pablo.
Thank you, Margarita, for this useful information on GEU mechanisms, the tools, the expertise that can be offered, and as well for giving us a glance on these field experiences that we already have in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we are going to go further on that on the second half of the webinar. And now we are going to share with you some of these field experiences. And we are going to give the floor to our colleague Rosanna Popescu, that is going to present us a case study specific. It was hard to find case studies among all these field experiences, but we have the pleasure of having Rosanna here that will share with us the case study of Hurricane Maria in Dominica in 2017. I'm pretty sure that after Dan's and Margarita's presentation, we'll have questions. Please don't forget to write them down in the questions and answers, the space within our chat. Roxana, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm talking to you from Belgium, but I will be presenting a mission in Dominica where I was deployed in 2017. The photo for my background is from a beach near Portsmouth in Dominica. So next slide, please. So on September 18, Dominica was hit by a Category 5 Hurricane Maria, causing extensive damage and losses through all the country, affecting almost 100% the economic and social sectors of Dominica, and thus generating a large amount of disaster waste. At least 2,000 deaths were reported, and Dominican flyovers confirmed that 18–19% of buildings were damaged to various degrees. The storm also tore apart homes, ravaged businesses, and wiped out infrastructure and agriculture. There were also countless roadblocks due to fallen trees and boulders, and that was acute need for clearing roads and management of debris, sediments, and disaster waste, generally speaking. So approximately 75% of trees were reported blown down or having branches stripped, which is a very unique case from my experience. So the damage caused by Hurricane Maria was extensive. So almost 100% of the agriculture sector was destroyed and the tourist infrastructure was heavily impacted. So the capital of Roseau was also very heavily affected. So next slide, please. So in this context, the government of Dominica, through the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, requested a technical assistance on disaster waste. The mission, consisting of 2 experts, was mobilized through OCHA and GU, and that were affiliated to the UNDAC team. The mobilization was possible through the support of Romanian government, through the European Civil Protection Mechanism, and the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Next slide, please. The mission objective was, in close collaboration with relevant local and national authorities and international emergency responders, to conduct an overall assessment of the disaster waste situation. That included an overall assessment of the disaster waste and identify specific risks posed to human health and environment, but also assess the existing local capacity for addressing disaster waste management issue and identify needs for further technical assistance, as well as recommendation on the short, medium, and long term. Of course, providing advice and support to any humanitarian stakeholder or to the post-disaster needs assessment was also part of the responsibilities. Next slide, please. The scope of the mission was adjusted to the challenges encountered on the field. As we arrived 3 weeks after the hurricane, a critical decision related to the disaster waste management were already made, like the selection of the temporary storage sites that are used to temporarily stock waste that are being cleared, but also a prioritization of the areas to be cleaned. Consequently, this made us focus more on the assessment assignment in order to give an overall and comprehensive picture of the situation. As a fact, the faster the request is being made, the better, in order to properly advise public authorities. So as the country was still recovering from the impact of Hurricane Erika, the critical infrastructure was heavily affected. Transport, water, communication, electricity, and waste management was not functioning. Limited accessibility because of the road blockages was a challenge in order to do the field visits, for example. So instead, we did as a first task, we did an assessment of the situation before the hurricane based on the data collected from authorities and also other stakeholders like MAP Action in order to understand the country's vulnerabilities. Collaboration and sharing of findings was also an important part. Other 2 United Nations Development Program experts on disaster waste were already on the ground when the team arrived, so the work could be divided The UNDP team focused on issues related to water management and debris, and the GU team, we focused on different type of waste at national. Collaboration with other agencies was also present, especially with PAFO on medical waste findings, and also with the local actors through all the process. Next slide, please. So in order to understand the country's capacity in managing disaster waste, we first looked at the institutional context, and it is interesting to note that it is different from normal time to crisis. If in normal time, it is the Dominica Solid Waste Management Corporation that has the responsibility to develop solid waste management facilities for storage, collection, treatment, and disposal. In crisis time, is the Ministry of Public Works that has the responsibility to identify solid waste, disposal, and landfill before a disaster, clear roads, and dispose of debris as directed by the National Emergency Operation Center. So this is an opportunity for a better organization of responsibility, for example, but also share of knowledge, of technical knowledge, field experience, and also logistical resources as trucks. That is a major factor that influences the speed and cleanup and the speed of the cleanup process. Finally, it's also interesting to note that the disaster waste is mentioned in the National Disaster Plan realized in 2001, but our findings showed that it has not been updated or developed ever since. So this observation shows the importance of preparedness in managing disaster waste as any other humanitarian sector, and including it in the contingency planning. Next slide, please. So managing the huge volume of waste that sometimes might mean the equivalent of 3 years of normal waste production in just one day, but also the diversity of the waste is a big challenge for any country, especially in island countries. It is not just the volume of waste diversity, but the cleanup process has to be quickly enough in order to allow the early recovery process to begin while managing environmental and health risks for the population. So in Dominica, as we can see in the photos, Maria produced waste like broken trees, trash vehicles, construction debris, different type of roofing materials, carpentry windows, broken furniture, domestic appliances, but also sand, silt, stone, rocks, and especially domestic waste that continued to be produced by the population while the waste collection system wasn't working. Next slide, please. In most of the cases, as it is the case in Dominica also, is to use temporarily store the waste on temporary storage sites before displacing them once again to treatment facilities or disposal. So choosing the location of this site is also a big challenge, especially in island countries because of the lack of space, mountainous terrains, and availability of public land. Moreover, other important criteria are the environmental and health risks like pollution. So the picture from the top row shows the two official sites that were chosen in Roseau. One is on a school ground and the other on a terrain next to the sea. And the second row, other informal and spontaneous storage sites created by the population that clearly shows a need of space in order to evacuate this waste. So these pictures are quite representative of what could be noticed in other countries, as well as that are helping to identify important criteria like choose a temporary storage site that does not hamper early recovery and that is not environmentally sensitive. As it's difficult to estimate from the beginning the time that the site will be occupied. Think like, for example, delegating a responsible for managing these sites, as they are also a place where waste can be sorted, but often they end up being mixed, which makes the process of treatment more costly and time-consuming at the end. And also think of integrating the informal storage sites and prepare the population on the importance of sorting the disaster waste, as some initiative could be noticed from the part of the population that were already started to sort by themselves. Next slide, please. So the support of the population is a great resource in crisis time. As often as it was the case in Dominica, the waste management system is affected and the existing facilities are destroyed by the force of the hurricane. This is why it is so important to prepare by identifying additional resources, for example, that can be mobilized in crisis time only. Next slide, please. So the key findings of our mission, and that were also presented to the national authorities, were organized on the importance of each type of waste from the point of view of environmental or health risks. A difference was also made between the normal and the post-disaster context, as it is helpful in order to easily identify vulnerabilities and capacities in the evolution of the waste management from the normal times to the crisis time. So the medical waste was identified as a major threat to public health, as there is no functioning facility or medical waste treatment. There is no adequate healthcare collection system or no incinerator for infectious medical waste. In the cases, the medical waste is being burned or just dumped in the landfill. So in the Prince Margaret Hospital, a disconnected freezer full of body parts was identified in the hospital backyard, as you can see in the photos, exposed to the sun and the rain. An action plan was presented for the biomedical waste management, and with the help of PAHO, a new incinerator was ordered during the mission. Next slide, please. The organic waste is also problematic, as in normal times there is a missing opportunity in composting the domestic waste practice that could help in post-disaster context and reduce the amount of organic waste that was simply burned, generating additional health risks. Next slide. The PET shredding facilities was damaged since Erica, so the sorting was already limited in normal times. So nothing changed in this aspect. Next slide, please. Concerning the metal waste, there are sorting practices in place. A special section of the landfill is dedicated to car parts, but treatment and collection and export is not structured. So it's still a sector that has to be developed. Next slide, please. There were no major risks identified by the hazardous waste. A remote assessment was done using the FIT methodology, but nothing was confirmed. Only a chlorine tank situated in a river was washed up by debris, but no damages were identified. Next slide. The construction waste are also problematic, as there is no management or specific landfill in place, but in the case of Dominica, there were not so many construction waste produced just after the hurricane. Next slide, please. So finally, what we called disaster debris is a mix of all types of debris that are difficult to sort: soil, stones, sand, wood, and pieces of construction, furniture, domestic appliances, and that most of the time end up being disposed in a landfill. Next slide, please. So on a medium and long term, this practice has to change as landfills on island countries are rapidly reaching capacity, as it is the case of Dominica too. The Foncole landfill that you can see on the photos was opened in 2007 and was initially planned to allow acceptable solid waste for a period of 15 to 20 years. So depending on the performance of the waste sorting system and the risk of disaster waste production in the future, the mission also presented a general action plan in order to identify a location for a new landfill that is necessary on the long term, also given the fact that, as you can see, it is located in a river steep narrow valley close to the sea. Next slide, please. So another example of recommendation, but also practical steps, is also these kind of logical schemes for disaster waste sorting and management that were presented in order to support the process and maximize the volume of waste that can be diverted from the landfill. Unfortunately, in most of the cases, most part of the disaster waste end up being landfilled. Next slide, please. Finally, here are some pictures that show the capital of Roseau approximately 1 month after the hurricane, which also shows a rapid cleanup, given the fact that the government made Roseau a high priority. Next slide, please. So the key recommendations are built around the idea that waste management is an integrating part of the disaster management cycle, but also a sustainable development strategy related to the place of Dominica in the Caribbean region. So one of the most important recommendations are to develop a long-term waste management strategy, integrating tourism development, which is considered an economic development priority of Dominica, include disaster waste into the future waste management master plan, as well as the disaster preparedness master plan. Consider biomedical waste as a potential hazard requiring more rigorous management and disposal standards. Secure a long-term operational and maintenance budget for waste, which ensures the continuity of public services and also of waste infrastructure, which we saw are vulnerable. And lastly, but not least, ensure waste management becomes a priority, allowing the country to harness economic opportunities of the Caribbean and regional waste market that has a lot of potential to be developed. Thank you, everyone. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roxana, for this powerful presentation that illustrates clearly as well the challenges, the success and importance of insurance, this dimension on the response. And we are going to go further in those experiences and on this case studies with Margarita, that she's going to present us now the response, environmental response to Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas in 2019. Please, I remind you as well, write down your questions and answers. After Margarita's presentation, we're going to go to the end of the webinar in which we're going to respond to those questions. Thank you, Margarita. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's jump straight into the case study with the next slide. So as you will remember, many of you will remember, Hurricane Dorian made landfall in 2019. It was the strongest hurricane to ever hit the Bahamas, and it made landfall on the 1st of September with the all clear given on the 4th of September. It was actually stationary for over 60 hours over the islands, and it particularly impacted Abaco and Grand Bahama Islands within the Bahamas. Now you see here on the screen also the exposed population. We are speaking about 17,000 people on Abaco and a little over 50,000 people on Grand Bahama. And of particular concern was the situation of about 7,000 migrants that were located on the islands. Next slide, please. Now, in response to this event, OCHA dispatched a total of 32 people over a period of 1 month after the hurricane made landfall. And initially, the initial response, including prepositioning before the hurricane, was provided by the regional office of OCHA, and that was complemented afterwards by a UNDAC team, a United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination team that was dispatched to support, and that embedded environmental expertise as well. Next slide, please. Now, if we look specifically at the environmental impacts of the hurricane, the main direct impacts were, of course, the generation of huge quantities of rubble and disaster waste of all sorts, including hazardous waste, but also an oil spill at Equinor's oil storage terminal on Grand Bahama. And this was just the direct impact in addition to residual risk. And I'll talk about that in a short while. Next slide, please. Now, in response to that, as I mentioned, we dispatched an UNDAC team. So just to give you an idea of the timeline, the UNDAC team, so there was prepositioning on 31st of August before the hurricane made landfall from OCHA colleagues in the region. And then the hurricane made landfall on the 1st of September. The all clear was given on the 4th of September, and the UNDAC team arrived on the 8th of September. So as you see, we're speaking of very fast deployments. And as the environmental expert as part of the UNDAC team. So I was first supporting in Abaco, on Abaco Island, and then I moved to Grand Bahama, and there I was joined also by 2 oil spill experts that we mobilized through the European Union Civil Protection Mechanism, which is one of our rostered institutions from the Joint Environment Unit, to look specifically at the oil spill that I was referring to before. So in total, we had 3 emergency operation centers, one located in the capital, in Nassau, and then one on Abaco and one on Grand Bahama, to look at the different impacts. Next slide, please. So this is one emergency that really gives you an idea of the variety of impacts that one unique emergency can cause, the variety of environmental impacts that one single emergency can cause. Now, the mission objectives for my own mission, so to support on the environmental side, were really to rapidly identify, assess, and mitigate any negative environmental impacts that were caused by the hurricane. And of course, the focus was on life-threatening risks, to advise on mitigation measures, looking both at short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures, and also to look at any cascading impacts or risks, so to try and prevent additional humanitarian during the mission, and also promote coordination, environmental coordination, and information sharing on environmental matters. And also, of course, one of the key tasks of any environmental expert that is dispatched is also, once on the ground, to identify the needs for additional specialized expertise, and that was the case for the oil spill, looking at all of the impacts that were caused by the event. Next slide, please. Now, the core areas of support in this specific emergency were 4. One was environmental coordination, so coordinating all the with all the other actors that also were working on cross-cutting issues related to environment, support on addressing hazmat risks, so hazardous material risks. There were many facilities handling hazardous substances that were heavily damaged by the hurricane, and so there were either small spills that already happened and also substantial residual risk linked to that. Disaster waste management, and also the oil spill that I mentioned before. Let's just look briefly at each of these areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of the coordination function, that's really to make use of the humanitarian coordination structure overall, to exploit the capacities and the expertise of everyone, of all the other actors, and also to maximize resources. And, I was dispatched, I was only one person, there was only otherwise, a certain amount of things that I could do, but the idea is really to have this multiplier effect by making use of inter-sector coordination meetings, to raise environmental issues, ask everyone while they're performing their own duties and looking at supporting response from their own angle, to also provide and share any information that could be useful then from an environmental viewpoint. You see here the Emergency Operations Center that we established in Abaco. Next slide, please. That was, of course, the international coordination structure that we set up for the humanitarian response overall, was mirroring that of the government, and the government also established an emergency support function specifically on environment as part of the national coordination structure. Now, the second area of support was, as I was mentioning before, hazmat risks. So in this sense, what I have done since my arrival in Abaco, but covering for Grand Bahama as well, was a rapid mapping of all the sites of concern. It was invaluable to already have a baseline of data that was collected by Dan and the regional office, and they maintain a record of facilities that handle hazardous substances in the region for all the different countries, and that's extremely useful then to already have an idea of where those sites of concern are, but then trying to complement that information with the information that was coming in from the ground and from the humanitarian actors that were involved in the response and that were helping through the coordination structure to report on any issues of concern, so to be able to refine this baseline. And so what we do usually is basically use the Flash environmental assessment tool. That is one of our flagship tools that Roxana was also referring to. It's a standard tool that is also available on the Environmental Emergency Center, and basically what it does is that it helps in having a quick and dirty understanding of what the hazards could be based on any substances, any specific substances that is stored in any sites of concern, in any facilities of concern. So basically it helps in estimating what is the likely substance that you'll find in a specific industry or power plant or gas station that you may encounter while you're operating on the ground. And just based on the type of facility, will tell you what is the likely substance. It will give you an idea of how you can quickly estimate the quantities of that substance just by visual inspection, and then have an idea of the distance up to which the substance can be harmful, either for human health or for the environment in terms of soil and water contamination, so that you can identify buffer zones and then identify any mitigation measures that are required. For example, establishing no-go zones or informing the population about any specific measures that they should also take. So all this work was really to rapidly map the sites of concern using whatever data we had before the emergency, applying the FIT, refining that information as more information was coming in from the ground, and then using that to identify, to basically run a prioritization exercise and to identify the facilities that had information were impacted, and so prioritize site surveys for those facilities at higher risk or where we knew that something had already happened, to be able to rapidly address the risks there and advise the government and local authorities on mitigation, working of course with the operators as well. Next slide, please. You'll see in the next slide, on the next slide, some of the maps that were produced to show the results of the application of the Flash Environmental Assessment tool. And so they show the buffer zones up to which there are risks for human health on the left, water contamination in the middle, and soil contamination to the right. Next slide, please. And here you see just a few of the sites that were prioritized based on this rapid assessment. And I'll just mention one, maybe a little more in detail, which is Marsh Harbor Power Substation. You see from the pictures that there is a diesel fuel that is actually located as basically escaped the tanks and is located in the containment area already, so it's exposed. And while we were there responding to Hurricane Dorian, there was a tropical storm that hit the Bahamas while we were already responding to Hurricane Dorian. So once this issue was reported and once I was able to visit the site and assess the situation there, it became a priority to empty those containment areas prior to the tropical storm, because of course all that fuel was exposed and could of course leak and causing harm not only to the environment but also to potentially the water supply system. Next slide, please. So that gives an idea of the kind of impact that you're faced with, and also gives you an idea of the magnitude. You know, there are so many issues that happen all together at the same time. So it's really key to work with all actors, in this particular case, working with the Army, to be able to then implement these mitigation measures once identified. So in this particular case, emptying the containment. The third area of support was disaster waste management. I worked with the Ministry of Environment, advising them on the development of a comprehensive disaster waste management plan that would include special considerations for hazardous waste. We've seen some of the examples before. So there was definitely many situations in which that involved also hazardous waste, and there were also several issues related to asbestos specifically. UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, was also working specifically only on debris management, so I worked very closely with them, and we advised across the different types of waste that were generated by the emergencies. Now, I just wish to mention another flagship tool that we have, which is the Disaster Waste Management Guidelines. All of these tools will be linked, and you will receive the direct links so that you can have a look at that. But that's the standard tool we'll use to be able to advise governments, and it's available for anyone to use. Next slide, please. The final area of support was helping the Ministry of Environment, again in liaison with the port authorities, to respond to the oil spill that occurred at Equinor's oil storage facility. You see here a picture. So there was a reported inland oil spill, and then there was also there were some reports initially of marine oil spills, but they were not proven to be true. So in addition to my own deployment, we mobilized 2 oil spill experts, as I mentioned before, to the European Union civil protection mechanisms, and they advised specifically on the environmental impacts related to the oil spill. So of course, the company was responding and trying to manage the oil spill itself, but then the Ministry of Environment requested support to look at the environmental impacts of those. And we did this work in partnership with the US Coast Guard that were also deployed in the Bahamas. Next slide, please. Now, this is just just a hint of all the work that I did there with my colleagues that were dispatched, deployed as well. But you can look at the full report of the mission on the Environmental Emergencies Center website. So we'll share the link also directly to the report with you. Please have a look. It just gives an idea also of the final product that we can deliver. Next slide, please. And with this, I would like to conclude, and I'm, of course, available for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Thank you very much, Roxana. Of course, all these presentations are going to be shared with you. That's why it's important for you to register after our seminar. And now we are going to open with the last minutes that we have in our schedule to take some questions and answers and leave our panelists to answer them. So the first question I would like to share with you is from Sarah Murphy, who asks, how does UNEP coordinate with NGO, or does it, especially in countries without cluster systems in place? Most of countries referenced do not have this system. Thank you, Sarah, for the question. Perhaps Dan could take this question since from his regional experience and perspective, and then we would like to take 2 more questions after this one. Thank you. Dan?
Sure. Thank you, Juan Pablo, and thank you, Sarah, for the question. It's a valid question because in LAC at the present time, I think only 3 countries have a cluster system formally activated. However, in virtually all countries with a UN presence, there is a country humanitarian team which brings together UN agencies and NGOs, and with a multi-sector mandate. And so if, for example, an environmental emergency response team were deployed, whether as a part of UNDAC or as a standalone team of experts, we would seek to integrate into that country humanitarian team and coordinate with UN agencies and NGOs through that mechanism. Sometimes there are other coordination structures which already exist, which NGOs are involved in, and I think it's important to try and use the structures that exist rather than creating new ones. Although we haven't had a deployment in the Dominican Republic, I'll take Dominican Republic as an example because it's a country I know very well. There is, since about 2009, there is a forum for disaster risk reduction, which is made up of NGOs, some UN agencies, and also the government. It's a civil society forum, but it also brings in occasional representation of government and UN. And it tends to scale up its work during emergency responses. So were I deployed to the Dominican Republic, I would expect the forum to probably be one of the spaces by which I could work with civil society in addition to the country humanitarian team. In big emergencies, particularly emergencies where an UNDAC team is deployed, as was the example in both Dominica and Bahamas and also Honduras last year, an on-site operations coordination center is often set up. In fact, in some of the photos from Margarita's presentation, you might have seen some of the tents, which were basically the office. An OSOC is basically an office, but it's kind of an information and coordination hub. And the idea is that it's available for everyone, including NGOs. And so the idea would be that it's a service provided to all humanitarian actors, whether they're UN, NGOs, government, whereby coordination can work and information can be shared. And again, as a deployed environmental actor, I would be seeking to work through that OSOC and through the intersector structures that exist. So I think it's important to bear in mind that even though there may not be a cluster available in the country, there is normally some variety of structure, often an intersector structure. And because you're often one or maybe two deployed environmental experts, intersector structures are usually the best way to reach the largest number of agencies and to cross the largest number of sectors or mandates. So it would depend on what exists, but there is almost always something that exists before an emergency, especially in a high-risk country, which NGOs can integrate into before disaster strikes, particularly the country humanitarian team. And you can normally find out more about that through the Office of the Resident Coordinator of the UN system in the country.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan, for your insights. And now we are going to raise an interesting question as well, that is that how is like to respond to an emergency today with the COVID-19 pandemic? And perhaps Margarita could answer to that, because she was deployed recently on the NOMDAC mission in Honduras, a mission within a COVID response context. Could you, Margarita?
Thank you. Sure. Yes, it's a very, and it's something, of course, that we have worked also a lot to prepare for. In the initial months after the declaration of the pandemic, we worked really a lot on adjusting and updating our business continuity plans to be able to respond to emergencies in the midst of a global pandemic. Now, we've had, as I was showing you before, 3 missions since during COVID. So Beirut, Mauritius, and Honduras. I've deployed on 2 of them, Beirut after the port explosions in August, and Honduras, as Juan Pablo was also mentioning. Now, there is, first of all, it really depends on whether countries open their borders for international assistance, depending, of course, on the measures that are in place, just before the emergency hits. So the measures have been changing during the pandemic, depending on the caseload of COVID in any particular country. And so, of course, the first question to ask is whether the country opens up the borders for international assistance. And so, therefore, if there is a request for international assistance and the government of the affected country opens up the border to receive humanitarian assistance, then we are able to still, mobilize support and to still deploy. Now, once on the ground, so that was the case, for example, in the case of Beirut, Mauritius, and Lebanon, right? We were able to deploy because those were the conditions. Now, once on the ground, we have developed very tough procedures to make sure that we did everything we could to prevent having a case within the team, and also, of course, causing any harm to the affected population or to the country that is receiving our assistance. So that included, for example, developing COVID-19 plans for the emergency operation centers, or the OSOC, as Dan referred to, which is usually our coordination. So having measures in place there to be able to ensure social distancing, but also disinfection after every meeting, every coordination meeting that may take place there or in any facilities that we run. Have all the teams trained and on personal and equipped with personal protection equipment to be able to also comply with any rules and regulations that are in place at the time of the response from the government, but also in line with our own international standards. So we have defined specific procedures for those, updating also our standard operation procedures that were already in place before, just for emergency response, to be able to implement all those measures and take all the precautions needed to still be able to dispatch teams in spite of the COVID pandemic. So that, of course, also includes having, flow charts with clear procedures for everyone to know if there is a reported COVID case, have a tracing system in place in the EOC and in any other locations that we use while responding, so that we can trace back in case there is a positive case, and also, of course, have all medical services mapped, whether their capacities in country or otherwise, of course, for international medical responses needed as well. So it's something that we worked hard to define before we actually had the first deployment during COVID. So adjusting everything that was already in place to be able really to have high standards of response. And now we have tested it in 3 emergencies. So it's quite a solid plan.
Well, thank you, Margarita, for these important insights. Very, very important given the context today. And now we are going to take a last question because of time constraints. Unfortunately, we would like to carry on discussing on this, but we will wrap up our webinar with this very important last question. That is, what if an emergency similar to Hurricane Dorian happened today? How different will be the response given the constraints? And I suppose that not only after Hurricane Dorian, any big storm that could happen today, and perhaps because of her field experience as well, Roxana could take this question. Roxana, could you?
Of course. Thank you for the question. Of course, we are talking about an extensive damage to a territory, so 100%. So they are not safe places, let's say, where we can rely on. Especially, of course, it depends also on the level of preparedness and the existing capacity and also logistical means existing on the ground. But taking into consideration the lessons learned from other past experiences would be to act very quickly just after the hurricane, integrate, let's say, the disaster waste management perspective and criteria from the first day of the decision making in the response, and wisely choose the temporary storage sites, which have to be well placed, let's say, between the affected area and the area where waste can be treated or disposed, because it will save a lot of time and money. Secondly, it will be the involvement of the population, very rapid and effective communication with the population, and which can be a very good resource because they are directly affected, and to think of sorting waste, avoid at maximum. It will be it will ease the treatment process at the end. And lastly, of course, strengthen the coordination between different type of actors, which is crucial because, as we saw, waste is present in every response sector, and is something that everyone can be aware of. That will be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roxana. Well, we reached the end of our webinar. On behalf of the team, our panelists, our technical support, Joint UNEP, UN Environment, and OCHA, and myself, thank you for being here with us. We're going to remain in contact. We're going to share all these documents after this webinar. Please remain alert on the activities that we will mention, the forum of ministers and focal points on environmental and emergencies, and the training in Mexico as well. So thank you for your time. Best wishes for this year, and remain safe, healthy, and we will be in contact with you for further activities and spaces. Without further ado, bye-bye, and thank you for your time again.